Hi folks, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy here for Chess University, and today I'll be starting my series on mastering endgame principles. The purpose of this series is to give you guys a intro and a solid foundation to what I believe are some of the most important concepts in playing well in the endgame phase of the game. So our first topic today is going to be about using your king in the endgame. If I had to pick one idea or concept that I think most club players, amateur players, and so on kind of struggle with or underestimate, is the power of the active king in the endgame. Basically, my feeling is that the king is just an extra piece that you can use in the endgame. Sure, it can get checked, it can get attacked, but with limited pieces on the board, actually using your king can really give you a big advantage in the position, as your king can obviously control key squares and attack stuff and support your passed pawns to victory. So our first game here is a really wonderful example of how an active king can actually win you the game. If you take a look at the position, you can see that material is equal. One of the main imbalances, of course, is that white has this bishop against black's knight. And it seems like white's pieces are definitely more active in general. The king is nicely centralized on d4, and this bishop appears to be more active than the knight on g7. So white would like to definitely make progress and try to win the game. The problem with the kind of obvious move c5 is that normally this would be a nice way to break through in the position, trying to get to black's c7 pawn. But of course here black would have something like rook d1 check, and white is a little bit in trouble here because he can't hold on to the pawn on c5. For example, king c4, rook c1 check, and black is going to be winning the c5 pawn. And this would of course be quite bad for white. So instead, the move played in the game was a really nice move, bishop e6 check. So the bishop has to be taken. Of course, if black plays king h8, then rook f8 is game over on the spot. So knight takes e6 is forced, d takes e6, and here black played rook takes e6, basically accepting the sacrificed pawn. In fact, this was kind of a mistake. According to the engines, the best move here was rook e5. Basically, keeping the rook on e5 would restrict white's king on d4 and not allow the king to press forward at all. And this e-pawn is of course not yet going anywhere. White can push e7 and then black can take it and win an important tempo. So it's interesting that even the engines understand that the best move here for black in the position would have been to prevent white's king from activating itself on d5 and then c6, as we'll see in this game. So black did take the pawn, rook takes e6. White played king d5, rook e7, and king c6. So white has given up a full pawn, and he's managed to activate his king basically to its full potential on c6. And black's pieces look very passive, but so what? I mean, white did give up a pawn, and just because your pieces are active doesn't mean that you're going to win the game. White actually needs some kind of concrete plan here to break through to actually win this endgame. So let's see how things progressed. Black played king g7, trying to get his king in. And now white plays rook f2. And now it might become clear what white is actually aiming for with this pawn sacrifice. He wants to bring the rook over to a2 and then a7 and then collect the c7 pawn. And once white takes that pawn, black's other pawns will then fall and white will be winning the resulting endgame. So it's really deep idea, all based on the fact that the king has become very active and can contribute to the fight. So black played rook e4, attacking the c-pawn, rook c2, and black is forced to go back, rook e7. Now white played b5, simply advancing the pawn before doing anything else, king f6, and here we go, rook a2. Now if black just sits here or plays something like king g5, trying to go after white's pawns, white will play rook a7 and of course take the c-pawn next. And because white's pawns are so far advanced already, white will definitely be winning the race here, and white is likely going to be able to promote one of his pawns on the queen side. So instead of doing that, black here played rook e4, offering a trade of pawns, which white accepts. King takes c7, rook takes c4, and king takes b6. So white has finally won back the pawn, and let's look at this resulting position. Black played d5. So both sides here have passed pawns, and our rooks are both reasonably active. But the difference in the king activity gives white a huge advantage here, and I would say close to winning, if not winning outright. Because white's king can actually support the passed pawn forward, whereas black's king is a tempo or two behind, as well as the d-pawn being one step behind its counterpart. So because of this very, very small edge in the race, white ends up succeeding first and wins this game. So let's see how that happened. d4, b6, king e5, b7. Notice how white's rook on a2 is so well placed to prevent any annoying checks on the a file. Black played rook b4. He's now forced to sacrifice his rook for the b pawn, and of course white promotes and wins the rook. Now white has won the rook, but things are still not that easy to win this endgame, because black now has a very active king. White's king is far away from the action, and black still has this d pawn on the board, which he can try to use and force white to give back the rook. So black tries exactly that, d3. And the only way for white to actually win this endgame is to immediately bring the king back into the game as soon as possible. So king c7, king e4, king d6, king e3, king e5. Now white's king is not going to be able to reach the pawn in time to stop it, but the king is close enough to black's pawns here on the king side that white can simply give up his rook for black's remaining pawn and then run his king over to g7 and collect all of black's pawns in the process. So d2 was played, rook a1, king e2, king f6, and the game concluded after takes, king g7, and black was forced to resign since they're losing both pawns here, and white will be easily winning the resulting king and pawn endgame. So I really like this example because it really shows the power of an active king in basically its most simplest form. Going from the beginning, white sacrificed the pawn here with bishop e6 check in order to fully activate his king by putting it on the c6 square. And then he was able to maneuver his rook over to a7 in order to win the c-pawn. And then, in that resulting endgame, white's king was also more active than its counterpart then, and white was able to use this to his advantage and end up winning by promoting his b-pawn. So I want to show you guys one more example here on this topic. This next game was played by a former world champion, Mr. Garry Kasparov. And from the opening, the players reached this endgame that you see here. And after white's next move, king e3, we can see again that white's king is a bit more centralized than black's, and this gives white a small advantage he can try to use in order to convert this endgame. So let's see what happened here. Black played b6, getting the pawn off of b7 so that he can develop the bishop, rook c1, and e6, challenging white's advanced d-pawn. White plays bishop c4, and here black plays e5. This move is a bit questionable, but black's idea is pretty understandable. He's trying to kind of close the center so that he can try and blockade white's pawn on d5. And I think this is a reasonable strategy, but we'll see Kasparov finds a way to break through really nicely in this position. So he starts with bishop b3, opening the rook to go to c7, bishop d7, and rook c7. One thing I'll say is that although I believe club players are pretty bad at using their kings in the endgame, most players are very, very aware that rooks just love the 7th rank. So I'm sure many of you guys listening out there would be able to make this move very easily and understand that this is the most active position for white's rook. Black played a5 and d6. White is definitely extending his pawn, and now the pawn is potentially hanging in some lines, but of course we're opening up the bishop against Black's f7 pawn, and as we can see from White's next few moves, this is going to be his target for the rest of the game. Of course, his rook and his bishop are already lined up perfectly to capitalize on the f7 pawn. Black played b5, desperately trying to get some queenside counterplay. And here comes, I think, the key move that really won this game for White, f4. Breaking Black's blockade and allowing White's e-pawn to come to e5 to support the d6 pawn. And notice that this move is only possible because White's king on e3 is supporting this idea. So again, the active king is really helpful in controlling certain squares, supporting your pawns forward. E takes f4, king takes, rook a6, and e5. Now White's pawns in the center look very, very dominant, and in addition to his pieces all being active, except of course for this rook on h1, which is going to join the game shortly, White is having a big advantage here. Black played a4, bishop d5, a3, and rook f1. So all of White's pieces are clearly aiming at the f7 point, and White is going to be able to use this to win the game. Black played rook a4 check, king e3, and bishop e6. Takes, and of course the second rook comes up to f7, and White has a decisive advantage in this rook endgame because his rooks are so active, the d6 pawn is protected and just so strong, and the fact that White has seized the 7th rank means that Black's king is also going to be in a lot of danger here. The game concluded very quickly, rook h4, rook g7 check, king h8, rook e7, and here Black had seen enough and resigned because basically White is going to be taking the e-pawn, and then he can push d7 and play rook e8 and basically promote his pawn by force. Notice how White's king, even here, is still contributing to the game, preventing Black's rook on h4 from defending against the d-pawn with a move like rook d4. So those are our examples for today. I hope these two examples gave you at least an introduction of this idea of how an active king can really be a huge boost to your endgames. This has been FIDE Master Kostya Kavutskiy for Chess University. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can see all of our upcoming videos, and if you're interested in more info on this topic, make sure to click the Take the Quiz button and answer some key questions on our site. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.